thank you for staying for this last presentation. I'm really proud of all of us, myself probably mostly, because it's a little bit pressure on me to prepare this ground for Gosia to do the closing ceremony. But at least we shared the name, so we can kind of we can mix that up. So that's good. Okay, let's jump right into it. So this, let's see. Okay, so this whole thing is an experiment. I don't mean so per se, but my presentation and the project that I did is an experiment. So if anyone would be interested in sharing their own opinions or sharing their ups and downs in their sort of journey in some elements of my experiment, I'm more than happy to do so, and know your opinion about parts of that experiment as well. Okay, so the experiment happened last year within a group of instructional designers creating content for call centers. And the idea behind it kind of came to me when my manager introduced this 80-20 rule, apparently taken from Google as well, when you can work 80% of your time on your work and then 20% of your time on, so to speak, sharpening the tool. So anything that was even loosely connected with whatever I was doing, I could do on Fridays and kind of make sure that I can develop myself. And if one of your manager styles that you can borrow from Sean from yesterday is to allow people to grow, then you might be careful as well, because then you might get someone like me who likes to turn the tables and see how we can introduce craziness. So I decided to sort of throw the caution to the wind, and instead of sharpening my particular, so in terms of, I know, tools or something, just kind of figure out how we can sharpen the life around instructional design and life around creating content for, not even for call centers, but for everyone. So what was the concept behind it? The way I kind of look at it, and especially with the topic that SOAP introduced this year, as in content as code, I kind of looked at all the rules and systems that we use for instructional design and thought that those constitute the code that we use to create content, at least that's how it felt to me in that particular situation a year ago. So for example, you can have an instructional design system. It doesn't have to be ADDIE. It can be any other model that you follow. It can be Rapid Design or some. But you do have the steps that you sort of go. And to me, this is that code that you would follow to create a particular piece of content. Another thing that to me sounded like a set of rules is creating learning goals, aims, objectives. So usually that's a step that you would perform in creating your piece of content as well, that you would make sure that you create those goals, you put all the steps in, you put everything that kind of makes sense to the learner. So that was to me another piece of code to me that I had to follow to create that content. Another one, Bloom's taxonomy, which if you're not familiar, it's this framework for categorizing how people learn from the basic concepts to more complex ideas. And basically, if you don't master the lower version, the easy concept, you can't really progress fully to the next version. And it is very heavily used in instructional design and in creating lesson plans at schools as well, just to categorize content and make sure that everyone understands what they're learning and how they're going to perform afterwards. So that's another piece of content that you take and kind of look at it and transfer it to your content, to your e-learning design. And another one is debunked at the moment, but still people use it, which is learning styles. Something that you would make sure that is included, especially in e-learning, when you can actually do exercises, you can do videos or audio only, and you can kind of go back and forth between some of those styles. And this is something that's another set of rules that you need to make sure that you touch everyone in your piece of content. And there's many more, because we can go chunking or micro learning. And but those are the four that kind of stood out to me in terms of creating my content. So what is my argument for that experiment? My argument, and sort of the thesis that I wanted to check, was to turn the tables, and instead of following those rules and following those codes, just start with the content itself. So don't think about anything else that surrounds it, but think about the content. And this is where the idea kind of came to be, that sometimes I feel like we follow those rules, and we like to think, or at least for me, I like to think that content is still in the first place. But in reality, when I looked at it, it looked like I was following the rules and maybe sometimes tweaking the content to make sure that it actually follows the rules, instead of focusing on content itself. So maybe why don't we start to, or try to do it the other way around? So this is where I started to introduce my switcheroo, and I decided that I still need to follow not rules of creating the content, but still to have a little bit of framework how I want to perform my experiment. So what were I called them assumptions, because I don't want to say it was code, because that's not what I'm trying to do, right? So assumptions. First, I knew that this is content for call centers. And I knew what the topic that I would like to use for my experiment would be. And it was something that was directed at people who, it was basically a train-the-trainer program for people who didn't think that they would end up as trainers, or they were asked by their manager to be trainers. Generally people who didn't really think that they will be doing in their life. So basic knowledge or no knowledge was required. And this is the topic that I was focused on, pre-training preparation. And to me, at least, it sounds very dull and very boring. And that was the task, to make it into a piece of e-learning content that people would like to follow, or follow at least. That was the idea behind it. So again, and then something that I thought I can have at my disposal was at least a little bit part of my brain. And then I thought, wait a second, maybe I can be more brains, because I had 6 other people in my team. So maybe I could use all of those 6 brains all together. Although sometimes when I look at fun times that we had, then I thought maybe not 6. But so that led me to, so I had my my topic, and I had my team and brains. And then I thought, okay, so this is the moment when I can finally put that experiment in action. But what will be another step, which was forget the rules. And in this particular case, it was so hard to forget the rules, because I kept coming back to having steps, or thinking about what is the next idea that I can introduce, or how can I formulate it. But all of those still felt to me like code. So it was really, really hard. And I don't think in this particular case, I was able to forget about rules 100%. I think they still were somewhere at the back of my head for that period of time. And how I actually introduced it to the content that I was writing for that particular topic. So instead of having a plan of going there, analyzing your audience, analyzing your topic, and then developing the topic, and then going back and forth for feedback, which is the basic structure of how to do it, the basic code as you would follow, I started first with developing a story of my own that I wanted to present to other people. So instead of trying to figure out how they work, what they do, and how would they apply it, I went with the idea that my idea would be best. So I developed a story, a little scenario of some guy coming into work and trying to do his first training, and then all of the things would fail, which again in my mind seemed like a good basis. So that was the first change that I introduced, and it was really hard in this particular moment not to think about the audience, but just to think about myself. So hard. And then I changed objectives, aims, whatever you want to put in this step. I changed them into wishes. So how it happened was, I went to some of my friends and went back to my old days in the call center to kind of talk to them, show them the story first, and talk to them about how they would like to approach the subject, but not from the perspective of what do you see wrong in the, say, look at the story and tell me what you would do differently. I wanted them to tell me all the positive things that they saw in the story. So instead of getting critical feedback, at least in my mind, instead of getting critical feedback from them on things that I could work on, I wanted them to point out only the positives. So again, to me, that felt like maybe turning the tables instead of trying to figure out what to correct. I wanted to develop the things that they thought were good and see what happens with that story. So that's another change. Then having that story, having that feedback from them, I decided not to use blooms, but again, talk to them. And it was not an official conversation with any of my friends. It was more of a face-to-face conversation. So I wanted them to tell me how they would phrase those wishes in their own language. So instead of going to blooms, which has a certain, you can get it in a version of a table, and you have words that you would use in a certain situation to describe goals or objectives or aims. I didn't want to go this road, because first of all, it does sound a little fake, but then I didn't want to assume anything about my audience again and how they would understand it. So I wanted them to come to me with the language. And they gave me some pointers on it. Most of them didn't really include Bloom's taxonomy verbs, but they had the same idea behind it. So at least that was something interesting to find out. And learning styles, I changed it into workplace style. So instead of talking about how you learn in terms of how you acquire knowledge, I wanted to tackle this from the perspective of how it happens in your particular workplace. Because even in a call center, for all those people that we had to think about when they switch from being in a first line or being a manager to being a trainer, even in a call center, in every single place, you're going to have different rules on what happens around you, different rules how you work. So it can be a very busy environment on the first floor when you pick up the calls, but it can be being a manager sitting in the room. So instead of thinking on how you acquire knowledge, I wanted to know how that knowledge transforms in the moment from the piece of content to you, but within the workplace. And that was probably, to be honest, the hardest part, because for me, this felt like that learning style and workplace style kind of are intertwined. And they do, like how you learn influences, or how your workplace works influences how you learn a little bit as well. So there was a little bit of a mashup here for me to figure out. So what's the effect? Obviously, I was working on a piece of content, and getting closer to it and having that story, having those positives to be maybe even blown out of proportion a little bit, but having some information from our audience and incorporating it into that piece of content, what I ended up with was a very, very short module with a story, based on a story, but that ended up with a checklist that someone could take and check if they make sure if they checked all the information and all the elements before going to perform their training. And this was the moment when I used the other brains in my team, because they didn't know that that I didn't follow Bloom's, and I didn't. Well, they saw Bloom's, but they didn't know that I tried to do this experiment. And they looked at that piece of content and that module from the perspective of following ADDIE, following Bloom's, and following objectives and learning styles. And this was the moment when they basically, with some minor changes, they basically accepted that module. And to me, it was a revelation, because I thought, okay, so this is the moment when that piece of content that was created with a completely different idea in mind actually looks like something that they say they would possibly create following all the rules. So that was the effect, and I wanted to share my findings from the situation when you end up with the same piece of content, and what was so interesting to me to find out in this particular experiment. So first, I kind of noticed that we have theories, and theories are so much regarded that oftentimes we don't really go back to challenge them, to question them. And this was probably the first moment when I thought there is a difference between saying I work as an instructional designer or I am an instructional designer. Because the first sentence to me sounded like I know all the theories, but the second sentence sounded to me like I worked through them on my own and I understood them or change them according to my own beliefs and to my own ideas. So it is worth to challenge the status quo, and it's worth to challenge the theories if you feel that you can bring something new. Fresh approach, so new ideas, again, this is something that is, even if you don't follow with that idea, that will spark a lot of creativity and a lot of thinking within your team, and a different way of looking at the piece of content. Even if the result is the same, you work through it yourself, and you have something to share with other people, and you have something to go back to and say, this is something that I worked through myself. And something that probably goes back to my own experience as a design thinking coach, which I tried not to include in this experiment either, which was probably hardest as well, was that the process is not really that important because the human-centered design, and just that element of me going back and even asking them questions that are not usually asked during interviews and audience analysis, but coming back and having conversations with them, that was that human approach that kind of led me to the same result, which is quite interesting. And final thoughts are that, to me, even though I arrived at the same conclusion and the same piece of content, to me, it kind of made me bolder in exercising my knowledge as an instructional designer. So I knew the theories and I read some books, but only me going through that phases of doing that experiment and trying to figure it out from a different perspective, only that gave me that courage to stand up in the next meeting and say, okay, I think maybe we could tackle this from a different perspective. And just the trust that I have now in myself is something that you're not going to get anywhere else but working through things on your own. But it's also something that is vital to exercising your job, at least in instructional design, when we create content for other people. So thank you for the possibility to share that experiment. And again, I kind of wonder if this is something that you could see or foresee from the beginning of the presentation, and you would be like, oh, well, I knew that. This is how it's going to end. Or if you have any other thoughts concerning that, because I like experimenting. And I like sharing with people, but learning from people as well, that human aspect of it too. So thank you so much for the possibility. And if you have any thoughts, just come and find me. Thank you.
Thank you, Gosia. Guys, do you have any questions about this experiment? One question here.
Okay, so there are two ways to put an arrow into the center of a target, right? You can try and shoot the arrow into the center of a target, or you can shoot an arrow at a wall and then draw a target around it.
Right.
So do you think maybe these methodologies sometimes come from, I've been creating these pieces of content all my life, now I'm going to come up with a brilliant theory that explains why I do it this way?
So I think, I don't know if that will answer your question, but what I think about this particular aspect of creating theories, I think that, first of all, there's a business side of things. Let's say you want to write a book, so that's one thing. And I think a lot of theories are created for that particular reason, unfortunately. But another thing is, you go into a new, for example, for me, and why trusting myself was so important, because I came into the job, I had some experience in teaching, but I came into the job and I read some books, but I never really had the time or back then even the idea to go in and exercise them on my own. I just trusted them completely, that someone drew all those, whatever their job was to arrive at their conclusion. But now I can come in and I can draw that circle, and I can even draw it a little further and say we should be having that goal instead of that goal. And I think that's the power that is the best. At least that's the power that I came to have from that experiment.
Okay, cool.
Thank you.
One question here.
Hi, Łukasz here. So I was wondering, you were talking about arriving at the same content, or as I understand it, right? So yeah, this is what I want to see. So how much of it was the same, really? Or if you had followed the steps, how much of it would be really the same?
Right. So about 75% would be the same, about 15% was changed, and it was mostly Bloom's taxonomy. For the sole reason of this is, even though we know our audience would understand it differently, but we want to keep it on a professional level, and don't let me get into a conversation why we should keep it on professional level if that's not the professional for our clients, but that's a different story. So about 15%, Bloom's taxonomy and learning styles. There were some changes that were made. There was a video introduced instead of some adult content, but 75% was basically the same. The story stayed the same. The journey stayed the same. The checklist stayed the same. So there you go.
Okay, thank you. And that was a great presentation.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I was like,
that's all right.
Scratching their head.
I have a question then.
Okay.
It became a sort of a tradition for me to take a selfie with Gosia, with you guys in the background. And this will be the third time that we'll take the selfie. And I was thinking how to approach it. Last year it was jazz hands. But I was thinking maybe we can go for John Paul II kind of glasses, if you can do it. And then I'll try to do one holding the phone. Or if you have a different crazy gesture, you can do it too. So we're a bunch of crazy people. And it's really, I'm just looking for people like me.
Do I do something with my, because I don't have hands now.
You don't have hands, you don't have to. They'll do it for you, right? Trust. Okay. Let me figure that out.
Yep.
All right, let's do it on...
closer to the people?
Right. Tell me stop. Okay. You guys ready? All right. On 3.
Okay, we can see them.
Well,
can we turn off the light here, because it's like making impossible for us.
First time to turn off. They usually end up.
Okay, let's
anyways.
try this.
Okay. Right. Okay. On 3. 1, 2, 3. Thank you. Thank you.
That looks really cool.
Good job.